All right, our next speaker is Dr. Tim Brown from the University of Nevada, in Reno, Nevada, in the United States of America. Tim.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone. What do I do? Number 3. Very good, thank you. I'm a Mac user. This is a PC. Okay, so this is a presentation about fire extremes and the pieces that we think are coming together to help make that happen. I am curious, by show of hands, we'll have a little audience involvement. How many of you think fire is becoming more extreme? Fire behavior is increasing? All right, quite a few. Good. All right. So, and I don't have the perfect answer for you on this, but Tamara Wall, my colleague here, this is going to be much of her work, actually, that I'm going to present on the social science side of this. But there are, and we'll get to that in a moment, but there are, I think, 3 shaping factors that lead to this idea of increasing fire extremes. There's the climate part, so climate change and more extreme weather. There's historical management practices and land use activities and expectations. Now, the things I'm going to be showing you are United States centric, but I have a feeling that these ideas are very global in nature. And so I guess we'll see from your reaction to this if you agree with that. And I hope we can explore this more on a global basis. So I'll first introduce maybe where each of these are coming from. For the climate part, of course, climate runs across large spatial scales, from the tree to the stands, the landscape to the ecoregion, but very much across time. So temporal scale of a few days out to millennial, thousands of years. Now, weather falls in there somewhere. I guess I can use this as a pointer here. So, oh, that was a bad idea. I do? Oh, is this set to stun? I don't want to hurt myself. Oh, there we go. All right. So on these time scales down here is where we have the fire events, and of course it's the weather, the wind that can create these very large explosive fire events. We tend to measure these with different kinds of drought indices, but drought then works on longer time scales along with these global teleconnection patterns in climate, and that leads to these longer term fire regimes. And a recent paper by Matt Jolly, who's speaking in room 2 right after this presentation actually, one of his papers here shows these red areas. The simplest way to think of this is over the past decades, since 1980 through near present, these are the regions where we've seen increases in the length of fire season based on a variety of fire danger indices, the US system, the Canadian system, and the Australian system. Now, another thing that's happening because of past management practices and fire exclusion, but there's also climate elements in this as well, is increase or changes in the vegetation. Here's a picture of the Bitterroot Forest taken in 1909. You can see the openness of the forest and the horses and the people actually being able to easily go through the forest. We see perhaps the researcher standing there. Just 40 years later, you can see the growth of this. Maybe that's the same researcher, I'm not sure. And by 1979, you can see how this is really filled in. right? So this picture was taken at the same location. Well, obviously, this is extensive fuel buildup, and so if fire is going to run through here, it's an increased likelihood of more extreme fire behavior. And then the third component of this are the people. A map of the U.S. showing these red areas show where the population has shifted and has increased, moved around, and as it turns out on this map, these red and orange areas are where people are living in the wildland-urban interface or the intermix areas. And so this is placing a lot of people directly in the path of fire, in the areas of fire, but also in areas of smoke for the human health impact component. Now, why people are living there, I think helps a little bit. There's two different types. And the question is, do people like the same type of place, or do they like a particular place? We can think of one group as being called place congruent. They are less likely to say that they would engage in mitigation actions that impacted the views from their home. Right? So they like it because the place feels natural. They want to live in this forested, in this semi-rural area. And they also say that if a fire were to run through, they would not likely come back to live in that same area. And then you have the opposite spectrum of that, which we call place referent. And they actually think more about the ecological timescales, and they are more willing to do mitigation actions, such as thinning or reducing the fuel loads. And also interested in the environment before and even after a fire event. So all this is now to put in context how some of these things are coming together. So we began with these guiding questions for this work. First of all, is wildfire behavior becoming more extreme outside of historical boundaries? And when we ask that question, we're thinking in terms of more of the physical environment. But now here's one: should firefighters be surprised by extreme wildfire behavior? And sometimes they are and they should be, and sometimes they are and they shouldn't be. And that's going to be partly related to experience and to training. And our wildland firefighter perceptions of what extreme fire behavior is that shifting with time. We've just begun some interviews with long career firefighters, those that say 30, 40-year kind of careers, to help sense that. But as you will see in this work, we have already talked to a range of firefighters from early career to longer career. And now what may be particularly relevant to this conference then is the question, is firefighter safety training sufficiently accounting for this new era of fire extremes? And not to give too much away, but I think it's not there yet, and there's some things that we can do. So in order to get to this, I just want to very briefly introduce you to this tool. It's called SenseMaker. It's a proprietary technology. So instead of doing surveys and interviews, you actually get firefighters to do micro-stories, and you can do this in an app. So on your smartphone or on your tablet, you can have unlimited data points. In fact, the more the better. And it also allows for a mix of qualitative and quantitative information. So in the analysis I'm going to show you, we collected 237 stories from firefighters. They were gathered from July of 14 through June of 2015. And you start with prompting questions. And from a social science perspective, this style is I think, is a lot nicer than, say, a survey, which can be very biased. And you can bias it here as well, but you have to be very careful about how you prompt. So for example, you ask, think about a time you saw a wildland fire do something you didn't think it could do. What happened? And when was the time you faced challenging fire behavior and felt really good about the work that you and your crew accomplished? Describe what happened. Or think about a time when a wildland fire did something and thought, oh no, this is not good. What happened? So these are the prompting questions, and then they can write a narrative associated with one of these questions. And here's just a very simple example of this. This particular firefighter was talking about this fire in northern Nevada, and says that crews, hand engines, dozers were fighting a flanking fire on an alluvial fan head parallel to a mountain range. And then a frontal wind hit midday and pushed the fire 20 plus miles north along one range through some passes into another mountain range. And the push was approximately 100,000 acres. So basically in a day, or part of a day, this happened. So now you can introduce a couple of different ways to start to get at the quantitative information. And there's what we call triad and dyad. So they can take this ball right here in this triangle and move it around. So what affected this story more? What the actions on this story were based more on what? Training, following directional orders, or experience? Or down here they can talk about resources were near available when needed, or so abundant they got in the way. So they can slide this scale around and they can move around within this triad. So here's an example, and we colored in. So the size of the dot indicates whether it was this season, the last 1 to 5 years, or more than 5 years ago. And the colors represent the years of fire experience at the time of the story. So we can see for this particular story, 36% of the respondents were talking about experience, and 9% following directions or orders. And this particular story was not so much about training. You can also map that out on different scales, so that people in this story acted based on the following directional orders on this scale, or the fire in the story was as expected or as predictable. So most predictable going to least predictable. This is the kind of map you probably need to sit and read and think about. So the short of this is, what we found is the more the fire behavior was predictable, the more likely actions were taken driven by directions or orders. And in this particular case, another case, we found that training was more relevant when fire behavior was more predictable. You might be starting to see a pattern here already. And on this last one, firefighters were more likely to act on experience with moderate levels of unpredictable fire. So the point being is, if it's the fire is more predictable, training was working. But as the fire became more unpredictable, then experience got more relied on. Well, then you can imagine if the fire is getting even more unpredictable, that experience might not be there. And so now trouble can ensue as a result of that. The last thing here is to think about is what types of fire behavior. Was it erratic, inexplicable? Was it predictable, as expected? And we can compare this with quantitative data. This graph shows a fire danger index, 2 of them actually, and these lines represent the 90th percentile, and the color scale is minimal fire behavior to extreme fire behavior. So sometimes it lines that we see extreme fire behavior matching the story. At other times it can be mixed. So this is not a perfect process, but gets a little bit about the perceptions. So our trends here is that the role of weather, and most often wind, was important in more than half the narratives. So we know that plays a role. Experienced firefighters provided narratives from across their years of experience, not just recent experiences. We also found that female firefighters were more likely to perceive the outcomes of the stories they shared as negative, although this is a small sample, so we need to think about that. The most experienced firefighters were more likely to view lack of resources as a problem. And the big one here at the bottom, the more fire is unpredictable, the more firefighters relied on experience other than training or orders. So the last summary slide here leads to this new paradigm, I think, needing training for effective safety risk mitigation strategy, given that the fire behavior now has potential to exceed known parameters of even the most experienced firefighters. And this is going to require new approaches to training that provides firefighters with necessary methods and tools to understand when they have moved into an event that exceeds their experience and determine whether to act immediately or better served by probing the situation, identifying possible responses, and then responding accordingly. So with that, greetings from my home in Reno, Nevada. Thank you. We do have time for questions, I'm being told. And I can make up my own too, so that's okay.
Thanks very much for that, Tim. You used the word unpredictable. Do you define unpredictable? The basis of the question is often something can determine whether something happens or doesn't happen.
Right.
Unpredictable to me as a mathematician means non-determinism or indeterminacy.
Sure.
But something usually can always resolve the indeterminacy, but we may not know what it is. What do you mean by unpredictable?
I think in this case, we're talking about the based on experience. Well, it could be two things. One is if you're out on the line, you're talking about, let me go back and start this way. If this is your first fire you've ever been on, it can seem like a huge complex kind of fire, right? Although in reality, for the experienced firefighters, there's nothing unusual about this particular fire. So in part, this unpredictability is related to the years of experience, how much you have. But also it's related to, it could be actual quantitative tools, I guess, to help with predictability, but I'm not really thinking about it that way. It's more about is the fire, does it change the tactics of how the fire operations, might take place, related to its just simply more extreme fire behavior. And I suppose it gets to a little bit into these ideas of things like there's known knowns, there's known unknowns, that kind of.
To quote a well-known American, yes.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, it's that kind of idea that we'd probably need to get into to change the training strategies on how to respond and deal with these situations. I don't know if that.
No, that was good.
Helped. Okay. I'll see a couple more.
Yeah. One of the main conclusion was that the weather was one of the driven factors of the uncertainty. Since we are getting better on forecasting short-term weather or even long-term, what is the link on extreme extreme fires uncertainty and the fact that we are better on forecasting weather?
Right. Probably the thing to think about there is I agree that weather forecasts are getting better. I think the climate forecasts are getting better, but they certainly lag behind weather. So, right, the more seasonal forecasts, monthly to 3 month kind of forecasts. But I think here the piece to really think about is what is the underlying climate? Has there been a long-term drought, or has there been a short-term drought that's all related to the fuel moisture? And if you have more fuels, if the climate is hotter, then that's going to increase, right, the burning intensity. And so it's when all those pieces come together. So you can have a sense that today, and there's tools for this, that today is going to be a more intense burning day, or that the risk is higher, of extreme fire behavior. I think that's in place, and those tools are getting better. The question is do we have the sufficient training, now for those days, and knowing that the increase in those days is likely to continue? Okay, thank you.